The transport ship dropped Kang Seojin on Vera 6 without ceremony or farewell, and the guards did not even look at him as the doors sealed shut behind him. He stood alone on the rocky landing platform as the ship rose into the gray sky, carrying away the last connection to everything he had once known and loved and fought for with every breath in his body. The wind cut through his thin prisoner clothes like frozen knives, and Sion pulled the fabric tighter around his shoulders as he surveyed his new home, a wasteland of black stone and dead valleys stretching endlessly toward distant mountains that scraped against the clouds like the claws of sleeping giants. This was where the Terran military alliance sent its unwanted, its criminals, its traitors. And according to the official records, Kang Seojin was all three. He had served the alliance for 15 years, rising through the ranks until he commanded his own battalion, until medals covered his chest and generals spoke his name with respect and admiration. But none of that mattered anymore, because 6 months ago, he had made a choice that erased everything he had built, everything he had earned, everything he had sacrificed. The memory came to him unbidden as he began walking toward the distant settlement, the screaming of alien children, the cold orders crackling through his helmet communicator, the faces of his soldiers waiting for him to give the command that would end innocent lives. Execute the prisoners. General Myung had ordered from the safety of his command ship orbiting far above the battlefield. Leave no witnesses to complicate our territorial claims. Seojin had looked at the huddled prisoners, women and children of the Veluxi species, their large eyes filled with terror, their small hands clutching each other in desperate hope that someone would show them mercy. And Seojin had made his choice. He had turned off his communicator, ordered his soldiers to stand down, and personally escorted every single prisoner to neutral territory where they could find safety and sanctuary. The court-martial had been swift and merciless, and they had stripped him of his rank, his citizenship, his honor, and his future before sending him here to die forgotten on a world that the galaxy had already forgotten. The settlement was worse than he had expected, a collection of rusted shelters and desperate faces, criminals and exiles fighting over scraps of food and drops of clean water like animals. Seojin did not stay long among them because he recognized the hunger in their eyes, the violence waiting just beneath the surface of their false smiles and friendly greetings. He gathered what supplies he could trade for and headed north toward the mountains, toward isolation, toward whatever remained of his broken life. The journey took 8 days of hard walking, and by the time Sion reached the foothills, his boots had worn through and his body ached with exhaustion that seemed to seep into his very bones. But the mountains offered something the settlement could not piece: solitude and the chance to live or die on his own terms without interference from others. He found a cave system carved into the base of a massive peak, and over the following weeks, he transformed it into something resembling a home. He built walls from loose stones, crafted tools from scavenged metal, and learned which plants were safe to eat and which streams carried water clean enough to drink. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, pushing away the nightmares that haunted him whenever he closed his eyes. One evening, as the twin suns of Vera 6 sank below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Seojin ventured deeper into the cave system than he had ever gone before. He carried a makeshift torch that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and his footsteps echoed in chambers that no human had ever seen or touched. The tunnel opened into a vast underground cavern, and Seojin stopped breathing when his torchlight revealed what lay within. Eggs, dozens of crystalline eggs arranged in careful patterns across the cavern floor, each one pulsing with soft inner light that shifted between colors like captured rainbows. They were enormous, reaching up to his chest, and heat radiated from them in gentle waves that warmed the cold stone around them. Seojin had never seen anything like them in all his years traveling the galaxy. and he approached slowly with wonder, replacing the emptiness that had lived in his heart since his exile. He knelt beside the nearest egg and placed his palm against its surface, feeling the warmth flow into his cold fingers, feeling something move within, something alive, something waiting to be born. "What are you?" he whispered into the silence. "Who left you here all alone?" The egg pulsed brighter at his touch, as if responding to his presence, as if recognizing something in him that he himself had forgotten. Seo-jun did not know how long he stayed in that cavern, surrounded by the gentle glow of unborn lives. But when he finally returned to his shelter, he felt something he had not felt in months. He felt purpose. Over the next several days, Seo-jun noticed strangers in the valley below, rough men with weapons and scanning equipment, searching the mountains with obvious intent and barely concealed greed. He watched them from hidden vantage points, tracking their movements, counting their numbers, recognizing their type from his years of military service. They were poachers, hunters of rare creatures and precious biological materials, and somehow they had learned about the eggs hidden in the mountain. Seo-jun returned to the cavern and stood among the eggs as the weight of his discovery pressed down upon his shoulders. He was one man exiled, disgraced, armed with nothing but primitive tools and fading memories of a life that no longer existed. The poachers were many, and they would kill him without hesitation to claim their prize. He could leave right now, slip away into the wilderness, let fate decide whether the eggs survived or perished. No one would blame him because no one would ever know. But as he looked at the eggs pulsing with innocent life, he thought of the Veluxi children he had saved, and he knew that running had never been something his heart could accept. "I will protect you," he promised the eggs, and his voice echoed through the cavern like a sacred oath. "Whatever comes, I will not let them take you." The third day of battle began before sunrise, and Kang Sejun woke to the sound of explosions echoing through the mountain. The mercenaries had brought demolition charges during the night, and they were blasting new entrances into the cave system to bypass the traps he had so carefully prepared. Sejun rose on legs that trembled with exhaustion and pain, and he checked his remaining ammunition, 18 bullets, one stolen knife, and a body that was already half dead from wounds that had not stopped bleeding. But the eggs behind him still pulsed with life, still waited for their chance to be born. And Seo-jun would not let them down while breath remained in his lungs. He moved through the tunnels with the silence of a shadow, his ears tracking the sounds of enemies approaching from 3 different directions. The first group came through a freshly blasted hole in the eastern passage, and Seo-jun met them with precise shots that dropped the lead mercenaries before they could orient themselves in the darkness. 5 bullets spent, 3 enemies dead, and the survivors screamed for backup as they scrambled for cover. Seo-jun did not wait for reinforcements to arrive. Instead, slipping through a narrow crack in the stone that led to the western tunnels where the second group was advancing, he caught them from behind, his knife finding gaps in their armor with the skill of a soldier who had spent a lifetime learning the art of war. 2 more fell before the mercenaries understood what was happening. And by then Seo-jun had vanished again into the labyrinth that he knew better than his own heartbeat. But the third group had reached the main cavern entrance, and Seo-jun arrived to find them cutting through his final barricade with plasma torches that melted stone like butter. He fired his remaining bullets without hesitation, dropping 4 mercenaries before his weapon clicked empty and useless in his hands. The survivors charged him with fury in their eyes, and Seo-jun met them with nothing but his knife and his bare hands and a refusal to surrender that burned brighter than any star. The fight was brutal and close, bodies crashing against stone walls as blood painted the tunnel floor in patterns of crimson and shadow. Seo-jun killed 2 more with his blade before a mercenary's rifle butt cracked against his skull and sent him staggering against the barricade. He could not see clearly anymore. His vision fractured into fragments of light and darkness, But his hands still knew how to fight, still remembered the motions that had kept him alive through 100 battles. He grabbed the nearest mercenary and drove his knife into the gap between helmet and armor. And the soldier collapsed with a gurgling cry that echoed through the tunnel. The remaining mercenaries fell back in confusion and fear, unable to understand how one wounded human could cause so much destruction. And then the Corvan leader arrived, pushing through his cowering soldiers, with contempt burning in his cybernetic eyes. "Enough!" The leader growled as he drew a massive blade that hummed with energy. "I will kill you myself." Sejun stood on broken legs and faced the monster before him, knowing that this was his final battle, his last chance to prove that his life had meant something more than the shame they had branded upon his name. The Corvan was faster than his size suggested, and his blade carved burning lines across Sejun's chest before the human could react. But Sejun had fought creatures larger and stronger before, and he knew that size meant nothing when will and purpose aligned in perfect harmony. He ducked under the next swing and drove his knife into the Corvan's knee joint, twisting the blade as the leader roared in pain and fury. The massive alien grabbed Sejun by the throat and lifted him from the ground, squeezing with strength that could crush stone into powder. "Die knowing you failed," the Corvan hissed as Sejun's vision began to darken. "My soldiers will take those eggs, and your sacrifice will mean nothing." But Sejun had one hand free, and in that hand he still held his bloody knife. He drove the blade into the Corvan's eye with every remaining ounce of strength in his body, and the leader screamed as he dropped Sejun to claw at the weapon buried in his skull. The Corvan fell, and Sejun fell with him, both bodies crashing against the cold stone floor in a tangle of blood and fading life. Sejun crawled toward the cavern entrance, leaving a trail of blood behind him, his broken body refusing to obey his commands even as his spirit screamed for just a few more moments of existence. The remaining mercenaries had fled at the sight of their leader's death, but Sejun knew they would return once they recovered from their shock and fear. He reached the entrance and collapsed there, his body forming a final barrier between the eggs and anyone who might come to claim them. The cavern glowed behind him with rainbow light, and Sejun thought he could feel the eggs pulsing with something like gratitude, something like love. "I could not save those children," he whispered as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. "They took my rank, my name, everything I had built, but they could not take my choice." Tears mixed with blood on his face as he thought of the Veluxi children he had saved. Hoped they had grown up safe and happy. Hoped they sometimes remembered the human soldier who had chosen their lives over his own future. "I could not save everyone," he breathed as his eyes began to close. "But I can save you." The last thing Kang Sejun saw was the light of the eggs growing brighter, and the last thing he heard was the sound of cracking shells and newborn cries. And then there was only silence and the peace that comes to those who die with clean consciences and unbowed spirits. But in the distance, shadows crossed the sky massive, winged shapes that blotted out the stars as they descended toward the mountain with fury older than the galaxy itself. The Dregvari had returned. The Poachers came on the morning of the 7th day, and Kang Sejun watched from his hidden position as 43 armed fighters assembled at the base of the mountain. Their leader was a massive Corvan with scarred gray skin and cybernetic implants that gleamed in the pale sunlight, and his voice carried up the slopes like thunder as he barked orders to his mercenaries. "The Dregvari eggs are worth more than this entire planet," the leader roared to his gathered soldiers. "Kill anyone who stands between us and our fortune." Dregvari, the word struck Sejun like a physical blow, and suddenly he understood what he had discovered in that hidden cavern. The Dregvari were legends whispered across the galaxy, an ancient species so powerful that even the greatest empires avoided their territory with religious fear. They were called dragons by the younger races, though their true form was something far more magnificent and terrifying than any myth could capture. And Seojun had stumbled upon their nesting ground, a sacred place where Drakvari mothers left their eggs to incubate in geothermal warmth while they hunted among the stars. The Poachers began their ascent, and Seojun retreated to the cave system, where he had spent the last 6 days preparing for this moment. He had no guns, no explosives, no armor, nothing but rocks and sharpened sticks and the tactical knowledge of a soldier who had fought across 100 worlds. But knowledge was a weapon too, and Seojun had used these days wisely. He had mapped every tunnel and chamber, identified every choke point and natural hazard, planted traps in every shadow where enemies might step. The first mercenaries entered the caves at midday, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as their boots crunched against the stone floor. Seojun waited in silence, his breathing slow and controlled, his body pressed against the narrow ledge above the main passage. The trap triggered when the lead scout stepped on the loose stones Seojun had carefully arranged, and the ceiling collapsed in a roar of dust and debris that buried 3 mercenaries before they could scream. Chaos erupted in the tunnel as the survivors scrambled backward, their weapons firing wildly at shadows that held no enemy. Seojun moved through passages they did not know existed, appearing behind them like a ghost, striking with his stone blade before vanishing again into the darkness. 2 more fell before the mercenaries retreated from the caves, dragging their wounded with curses and confused shouts. The Corvan leader raged at his soldiers as Seojun watched from a hidden crevice near the cave entrance, and the sight of their fear gave him strength he did not know he still possessed. "One man," the leader snarled at his mercenaries. "One human is making fools of you all." But they did not attack again that day, choosing instead to make camp at the mountain base while they planned their next assault. Night fell over the mountain, and Seojun returned to the egg cavern where the gentle glow welcomed him like the warmth of a family hearth. He sat among the eggs with his back against the cool stone wall, and exhaustion pulled at his eyelids as blood seeped from cuts he had not noticed during the fighting. "I was a soldier once," he told the eggs in a soft voice that echoed through the cavern. "I fought in wars that stretched across star systems, and I thought that was what gave my life meaning." The eggs pulsed with their rainbow light as if listening to every word he spoke. "But I was wrong," Seojun continued as memories of the Veluxi children filled his mind. "The meaning was never in the fighting, it was in what I chose to fight for." He closed his eyes and remembered the moment that had ended his career and begun his exile. General Myung had wanted those children dead, because their testimony could have exposed the Alliance's illegal expansion into neutral territory. Politics, territory, power. Those were the reasons innocent lives were supposed to end that day. And Seojun had looked at those frightened faces and seen his own humanity reflected in their alien eyes. He had made his choice, and he had never regretted it for a single moment. Not even when they stripped his medals from his chest and erased his name from the records of honor. "I could not save everyone," he whispered to the eggs. "But I saved them, and maybe that is enough for one life." Dawn brought the second assault, and this time the mercenaries came, prepared with gas grenades and thermal sensors that could track his body heat through solid stone. Seojun fought in the narrow passages where their numbers meant nothing, where each enemy had to face him alone in the choking darkness. His stone blade broke against a mercenary's armor, so he took the fallen soldier's weapon and continued fighting with bullets instead of rocks. Hours blurred together in a symphony of violence and desperation, and Seojun lost count of how many enemies he killed as his body accumulated wounds that screamed for rest and healing. A blade caught his shoulder, and a bullet grazed his thigh. And still he fought because surrendering meant death for the innocent lives he had sworn to protect. By nightfall, the mercenaries retreated again, leaving 11 more of their number dead in the tunnels. But Seojun could barely stand as he stumbled back to the egg cavern, his vision swimming and his legs threatening to collapse with every step. He had perhaps 20 bullets remaining and strength enough for one more day of fighting, maybe less. The Poachers still numbered nearly 30, and their leader was already calling for reinforcements from other syndicates who would smell profit in Drakvari eggs. Sejong knew how this would end, had known from the moment he made his promise to protect these unborn lives. He would die here in this mountain, far from home, unmourned and unremembered by anyone who had once called him friend or brother. But as he sat among the eggs with his wounds bleeding and his body failing, Kang Sejun smiled. Because dying for something precious was better than living for nothing at all. "Hold on," he whispered to the eggs as sleep finally claimed him. "Just hold on a little longer." The Drakvari matriarch landed on the mountain with a force that shook the stone beneath her massive form, and her golden eyes swept across the battlefield with ancient fury burning in their depths. She was magnificent beyond description, scales of deep crimson that shifted to purple where the starlight touched them, wings that could embrace entire cities, and a presence that made the very air tremble with power and majesty. Her name was Verenthes, and she had lived for 6,000 years, and watched empires rise and crumble, had seen species evolve and fade into extinction. But never in all her centuries had she witnessed what lay before her now. Dead mercenaries littered the mountain slopes, their bodies torn and broken, their weapons scattered like toys discarded by angry children. And at the entrance to her nesting cavern lay a single human, small, fragile, covered in wounds that spoke of a battle fought against impossible odds. Verenthes approached the body with steps that cracked the stone beneath her weight, and something strange stirred in her ancient heart as she looked upon the fallen warrior. He had positioned himself in death as a final barrier, his arms spread wide as if embracing the cavern he had sworn to protect. Behind him, her eggs were hatching, and the newborn Drakvari cried out with voices that echoed across dimensions as they took their first breaths of life. The hatchlings stumbled toward the human's body with unsteady steps, their tiny claws gentle as they touched his still face, their cries shifting from hunger to something that sounded almost like grief. They had imprinted on his scent. Verenthes realized with shock imprinted on the creature, who had given everything to protect them during the most vulnerable moments of their existence. She lowered her great head and extended her consciousness toward the human's fading essence, touching the memories that still lingered in his cooling flesh. And Verenthes saw everything. She saw Kang Sejun's life flash before her in waves of emotion and experience, his childhood on Earth, his years of military service, his rise through the ranks of a civilization that had never understood his true worth. She saw the moment that had destroyed him, the Veluxi children huddled in fear, the orders crackling through his helmet, the choice that had cost him everything he had ever earned. She saw his exile, his discovery of her eggs, his decision to stand against an army with nothing but rocks and determination and a heart that refused to abandon the innocent. And she saw his final moments, the pain, the exhaustion, the absolute certainty that he would die, and the complete absence of regret in his fading thoughts. Verenthes withdrew from his memories with tears forming in eyes that had not wept in 1,000 years. This human, this small, fragile creature from a species her kind had dismissed as primitive and insignificant, had done what no other being in galactic history had ever done. He had protected Drakvari young, had fought and died for children that were not his own, had shown courage that would shame the mightiest warriors of any species. The remaining mercenaries had regrouped at the base of the mountain, their reinforcements arriving in ships that darkened the sky with their numbers. But when they looked up and saw Verenthes standing on the peak with her wings spread wide, their courage evaporated like morning dew beneath a burning sun. The matriarch's roar split the heavens, a sound of grief and rage that would echo in the nightmares of every creature who heard it for the rest of their miserable lives. Fire erupted from her throat, and streams of white heat that turned ships to ash and soldiers to shadows burned into the stone. Within minutes, nothing remained of the poaching syndicate except scattered debris and the screams of those who had fled fast enough to survive. Voranthus summoned the Drekvari High Council with a psychic call that reached across the galaxy, and within hours the mountain was surrounded by dragons of every color and age. They came to witness what their matriarch had discovered, to see the human who had rewritten everything they believed about the younger species. The council gathered in the great cavern where Seogen's body still lay, and their combined presence filled the space with power that made the air itself hum with barely contained energy. This human must be honored, Voranthus declared to the assembled council. He must be remembered in our traditions, his story told to every generation that hatches after us. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the council, because no non-Drekvari had ever been granted such recognition in all the eons of their existence. He was insignificant, one elder protested with scales of deep blue that shimmered with uncertainty. A single human from a species barely capable of reaching the stars. He was everything, Voranthus replied with a voice that silenced all objections. He did not protect my children for reward or recognition. He did not even know we would return. She looked down at Saijan's peaceful face, at the small smile that had formed on his lips as death claimed him. He chose to die for children that were not his own, knowing that no one would ever know, that no one would ever thank him, that his sacrifice would vanish into the darkness of this forgotten world. The council fell silent as the weight of her words settled upon them. This is not insignificance, Voranthus continued with emotion breaking through her ancient composure. This is what we once were, before we grew proud and distant and forgot what it meant to protect the helpless. She raised her head and met the eyes of every council member with a gaze that demanded answer. This human has reminded us who we are meant to be, and for that gift, he deserves to be remembered until the stars themselves grow cold and dark. The vote was unanimous, and for the first time in Drekvari history, a non-Drekvari was granted the highest honor their civilization could bestow. Kang Seonjan, Exile, and Traitor would become legend. 100 years passed, and the galaxy transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Drekvari, who had isolated themselves from younger species for millennia, now stood as humanity's greatest allies and protectors. Their fleets patrolled human borders, their diplomats spoke in human councils, and their warriors fought alongside human soldiers in conflicts that shaped the destiny of 1,000 worlds. And it all began with one man who died alone on a forgotten mountain. The story of Kang Sejun had spread across the stars like wildfire, passed from species to species until every civilization knew the tale of the exiled warrior who had given his life for dragon eggs. Children on distant planets played games where they pretended to be Seogen, standing brave against imaginary enemies while protecting imaginary treasures. Soldiers whispered his name before battle, drawing courage from his example, reminding themselves that one person could change the fate of galaxies. On Vera 6, the mountain where Seogen had made his final stand was now sacred ground, transformed into a monument that drew pilgrims from every corner of known space. The caves where he had fought still bore the marks of his desperate battle-scorched marks on the walls, grooves in the stone where bodies had fallen, and the entrance where his blood had soaked into the rock and never fully faded. But the centerpiece of the monument was the statue that stood in the great cavern where the eggs had once waited for their guardian. It depicted Sajun as he had been in his final moments, arms spread wide, face lifted toward the light, his expression one of peace and purpose that transcended the agony of his wounds. The statue was carved from crystal that the Drekvari had harvested from the heart of a dying star, and it glowed with inner light that shifted through every color of the rainbow. Around its base were inscribed the words that Voranthus herself had composed. Here stood Kang Sion of Earth Exile, Traitor, legend, who taught the dragons that courage has no size and love has no species. The Drakvari matriarch still lived, her centuries-long lifespan barely touched by the 100 years since Seojin's death. She visited the statue often, sometimes alone, and sometimes with her children, the very hatchlings that Seiyun had died to protect. They had grown into magnificent adults now, their scales gleaming with colors that seemed to shift with their moods, their wings capable of carrying them across star systems in the blink of an eye. But they always became quiet when they stood before Seojin's statue, always bowed their great heads in respect to the small human who had given them the chance to exist. "Tell us again," the eldest hatchling asked during one such visit, her voice soft with reverence. "Tell us what you saw in his memories." Voranthus smiled with ancient eyes that held both sorrow and joy in equal measure. "I saw a man who had lost everything," she said as she gazed at the glowing statue. "His rank, his honor, his home, his future, all taken because he refused to murder innocent children." The hatchlings listened with the intensity of creatures hearing their creation story for the 1,000th time. "The galaxy told him he was worthless," Voranthus continued. "They sent him here to die forgotten, to fade into nothing, to be erased from history as if he had never existed." She placed one massive claw gently against the statue's base, touching the place where Seojin's feet were carved into the crystal. "But when he found your eggs, when he understood what you were and what you meant, he did not hesitate for even a moment." Tears formed in the matriarch's eyes, the same tears that came every time she told this story. He knew he would die. He was certain of it from the very first day, but he stayed anyway, because protecting the innocent was more important to him than his own survival. She turned to face her children, her gaze moving from one to the next with love that had grown deeper with every passing year. "Your father was a Drakvari of noble lineage," she told them. "But this human gave you something your father could not. He gave you the chance to breathe, to grow, to become who you are." The eldest hatchling lowered her head until her snout touched the cavern floor in the deepest gesture of respect her kind could offer. "Then he is our father too," she declared with a voice that echoed with certainty, "in all the ways that matter most." Far across the galaxy, a young human soldier named Park Himen stood before a small replica of Seojin's statue in the memorial hall of the Terran Military Academy. She was about to graduate, about to receive her commission, about to begin a career in the same military that had once destroyed Kang Seiyun for the crime of showing mercy. But the military had changed in 100 years, transformed by the consequences of its own cruelty. When the Drakvari had revealed what happened on Vera 6, when they had shown the galaxy that humanity was capable of producing souls like Seijun, the shame had been overwhelming. The generals who had exiled him were long dead, but their successors had worked for generations to rebuild an institution worthy of the man they had betrayed. Now every graduating class took an oath before Seojin's image, swearing to uphold the values he had died for: compassion, courage, and the protection of innocent life above all else. Himin pressed her palm against the statue's base and felt tears running down her cheeks. "I understand now," she whispered to the stone face that gazed down at her with eternal serenity. "They called you Exile. They called you traitor. But the dragons called you father." She stepped back and saluted with perfect precision, honoring the legend who had taught the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength was never in conquest or technology or military might. "And we call you hero," she finished as pride swelled in her chest. "Now and forever, until the stars themselves grow cold." Outside the academy windows, a Drakvari ship passed overhead, and its crew dipped their wings in salute to the humans below. Two species, joined forever by the sacrifice of one man who had proven that love transcends all boundaries and courage knows no limits. Kang Seojin had died alone on a forgotten world, unmourned and unremembered. But his legacy lived on in every hand extended in friendship, every life protected from harm, every choice made in favor of compassion over cruelty. And that was enough, more than enough, for one human life.